Back in 1995, I didn't go to university and was working at night in the so-called red light district. Around the same time, my cousin was opening a Japanese restaurant in Korea, and because it turned out to be more popular than he expected, he asked if I could come and help him out. My future was bleak and there wasn't any reason to be tied down to Japan, so I got permission from my parents before accepting the offer and flew to South Korea. The restaurant was about 15 minutes away, but it was in a pretty busy area with people coming and going at all hours, so I felt relatively safe. I studied Korean during the day and worked hard in the kitchen at night. Before I knew it, a year had passed and I was quite content with my life at that point. By this time, I was able to have basic conversations in Korean and became pretty knowledgeable with the various city sites. At the restaurant, which, lucky for us, was still busy, I took on the position of kitchen manager. One day, when I returned to my apartment, I found all my unused clothes lying on the floor. And then I noticed that all the pictures I had pinned up on the wall were gone. The worst thing, though, was that my underwear was placed carefully, one by one, from my dresser drawer to the entrance. I instantly felt scared and called my cousin straight away. I asked, "Hey, did you or your wife drop by today?" To which he replied that neither of them had. His wife was heavily pregnant and he spent more time at the restaurant than I did, so I didn't doubt it for a second. Just to be on the safe side, I asked if any of his other family members might have come over, but just as I had surmised, the answer was a no. Feeling a sense of dread, I asked him to call the police for me. Since nothing was stolen, the police couldn't do anything. They left after telling me to call again if anything else happened. I was way too scared to stay in the apartment by myself, so I crashed at my cousin's place that night. After work the next day, I didn't want to go back to my apartment alone, so I asked one of the part-timers, Miju, who had lived in Japan for a short time as an exchange student, to come for a sleepover. She was happy to keep me company, and we chatted away as we walked to my apartment. When we got to the front door, we both froze and my blood ran cold. The words, "Do not trespass," were scrawled on the door with red spray paint. Miju broke the silence and voiced her concern that this situation was now becoming dangerous. We ran out of the apartment complex for fear that someone might jump out of my unit and called the police straight away. Knowing what had happened just the night before, when they showed up to the apartment, a group of men that looked like SWAT team were leading the way. We were told to wait outside while the men went in. Miju stood with me until a detective came out with an extremely serious look on his face. He spoke to both of us in Korean, and I couldn't understand 100% of what he was saying, so I asked Miju to translate for me. She looked pale when she turned to me and said, I'm going home as soon as I tell you what happened, but you need to call your cousin to come here right now." I did what she asked. After hanging up the phone, I looked at Miju, anxious to know what was going on. Her teeth were chattering and she looked like she was about to cry. She finally said, "A man has committed suicide in your room. The police want to know whether you know him, so they want you to go take a look." My mind went blank. I didn't know what to say and couldn't wrap my head around this insane turn of events. I wanted my cousin there with me because he was the only one that could make me feel a tiny bit better, so I asked the detective if they could wait until he arrived, and he agreed. After that, Miju quickly hailed a taxi and sped out of there. I couldn't blame her. When my cousin finally arrived, the detective led us into my apartment. As soon as I crossed into the threshold, I smelled death, which is something that I can't explain with words. When I saw the man laying there, I threw up all over the floor. I didn't want to look, but I had to do it to see if I knew him. And I did. He was a regular customer who came in quite frequently ever since I started working at the restaurant. I didn't know anything about him. I didn't even know his name, but I remembered him asking me out to dinner several times, and I turned him down every single time. I told the detectives everything I could think of, which really wasn't much, and after gathering up the bare necessities, I went to my cousin's house. He gave me a day off the next day, so I stayed home with his wife. That's when she reluctantly told me the following. The man found in my room the previous night was persistently asking my cousin to introduce me to him because he wanted to date me. But my cousin never did because he didn't want to cause me any trouble. He always managed to change the conversation and ultimately ignored all of the man's requests. Not even a month later, I decided to move back to Japan. People around me were extremely supportive, but I felt like everything got ruined and I couldn't bring myself to enjoy living in Korea any longer. Even to this day, I have vivid flashbacks of the man's face when I saw him. And I have sleepless nights where I can't stop thinking about what might have happened if I had walked into my apartment that night, all alone, just before he did that final act. When I was in elementary school, I had a classmate named Ozawa. I'd known him since kindergarten and I considered him to be my best friend. We were so close, we never fought. It was 25 years ago when we were in 4th grade when he suddenly disappeared. I still can't believe it's already been that long. That day, we were walking home together. It was just before summer break and I remember we were talking about trivial things like what we were going to do, the places we wanted to go, and making plans to do homework together. Then, I felt someone's presence behind me. When I turned around, I saw a gaunt man a few meters behind us. The mountain behind the school had a single road passing through it. Hardly any cars used it, let alone people on foot. The school had forbidden us to use it to commute to and from school due to rumors of perverts and other untoward people lurking around. However, Ozawa and I used it often because it was the quickest way home. I whispered to him, "Hey, there's a weird guy behind us." I think he was in his mid-20s and he looked dirty and disheveled like a homeless man. The man's eyes were fixed on us and was walking quickly, gradually closing the distance between us. When Ozawa saw the man, he let out the loudest scream and started to run. I didn't know why he screamed and thought maybe the man had started running after us, but when I turned around, he was still walking. His scream freaked me out and I yelled out to him to wait for me and ran after him. Did Ozawa know that man? He was probably some kind of pervert, considering we were in the woods. That's what I was thinking while I ran after him. After a few seconds, I heard footsteps behind me. The man had also begun to run after us, and when I realized what was happening, I also began to scream. The footsteps were catching up to me, and when I could almost feel his body on me, I thought that was it. He was going to grab me and take me somewhere, do unspeakable things to me. I was imagining terrible things and was almost shitting my pants when I saw the man run straight past me and gunning it towards Ozawa. I stopped running and stood there, watching everything unfold before my eyes. The man caught up to Ozawa and grabbed him. Ozawa screamed for help as the man grabbed onto his bag. His scream jolted me back to reality, and I also began screaming and yelling. I yelled as loud as I could for help, but we were in the mountains and we were all alone. Ozawa was on all fours, desperately trying to grab onto anything he could and fighting against the man. He was yelling for the man to stop and how he didn't want to go. The man grabbed Ozawa's arm and forcibly pulled him up to his feet. He then dragged him into the bushes and disappeared. I could hear Ozawa screaming and crying, but those sounds gradually got fainter. I stood there in disbelief. I was petrified and couldn't move for what felt like ages. And then everything went silent. Without thinking, I picked up a nearby tree branch and jumped into the bushes where the man dragged Ozawa into. It was easy to follow where they went because there was a trail of broken twigs and trampled plants. My body was pumping with adrenaline, so I didn't even feel any fear at this point. I only had one thing on my mind, and that was to find Ozawa and rescue him. After about 30 meters, I came to an open area. Ozawa's bag was lying on the ground. I looked around, but I couldn't see or hear him nor the man. I searched around for God knows how long in pure desperation, but was unsuccessful. I hurried back to the path, grabbed my bag, and ran to Ozawa's house. I rang the doorbell and his mum answered. She seemed surprised to see me standing there and started to ask whether I needed anything when I cut her off and told her that Ozawa had been kidnapped. I don't know whether she didn't hear me or maybe she thought I was playing a bad joke on her because she asked me what I meant. In a full-fledged panic, I repeated myself. I said Ozawa's been kidnapped by a weird man. His mum got a worried look on her face and said in a calming voice, Hey, it's all right, calm down. You know I don't have a son, right? What? My mind went blank. I tried to voice out some words, but nothing came out. I was holding his school bag and all I could do was hand it over to her. His mum took it and looked at it. Where'd you get this? It has the name Ozawa on it, but it's not ours. That's impossible. Ozawa lives here. It was at this point where his mum couldn't hide her concern and she told me to stay there because she was going to get my mum. I lived across the road from them, so it was an easy thing to do. She left me standing there in a complete state of confusion and hurried to my house. She rang my doorbell and my mum answered. They talked for a while and the two walked back to where I was. Once they were there, I told them again what had just happened. But, just like Ozawa's mum, my mum was also clueless. She had no idea who I was talking about. So, who was I just walking with? They eventually concluded that I had indeed seen someone getting kidnapped, and I was in shock, and that was the reason why I wasn't making sense. Either way, my mum hurried back to the house to call the police, just in case. About 10 minutes later, my mum came back out, and shortly thereafter, the police arrived. I told the two police officers what I saw. I also told them that neither his mum nor my mum knew who Ozawa, my friend who had been kidnapped, was. The police looked utterly confused and asked them about Ozawa, to which they both denied knowing who I was talking about. The police pretty much concluded the same thing as the parents. I was talking nonsense because I was in shock from witnessing an abduction. They asked me to show them where everything happened, so I took them to the scene. I showed them where I first saw the man and where he started to chase us, took them to where Ozawa was pulled into the bushes all the way to the clearing. At first they looked like they were just entertaining me, listening with half an ear because the kidnapped kid, according to the adults, didn't exist. But upon entering the bushes and seeing traces of a struggle, their expression changed. After we arrived at the clearing, the police told me I could go home and one of the other officers drove me back. The next morning when I stepped out to go to school, Ozawa, who was always coming out of his house across the road, didn't appear. I walked to school alone. It seemed like everyone had heard the news from the previous day because as soon as I entered the classroom, everyone rushed over to me to know more details. And I told them everything that happened to Ozawa. And they all started saying, "Who's that? We don't have anyone called Ozawa in our class." I was doing my best to keep my cool and explained how he was the kid that sat in the third row from the front, closest to the hallway. They all looked at me incredulously. I blabbed on for a while, describing him to everyone to try to make them remember who he was, but to no avail. Because I was so fixated on Ozawa being real, I ended up being called a liar, although that didn't last long. After this day, I could finally see why people would think that I was lying. I couldn't find a trace of the boy who had been my best friend for years. He was gone from our school newspaper clippings, calligraphy exhibits, from field trip class photos. He had even disappeared from all of our pictures that I had at home. This was the final nail in the coffin. I had no choice but to accept the fact that he never really existed. The days and years passed. By the time I was at uni, Ozawa had become a long-lost memory. In Japan, when we turn 20, there's a huge coming-of-age ceremony all across Japan. On this day, there was a reunion, and for the first time in years, his name was mentioned. My classmates started talking about the time when I made up a story of some kid being kidnapped, and they all made jabs at me. This incident reminded me of his existence for the first time in years. I remember the times we had spent together, but at this point, I was doubting those fond memories. After a while, I concluded once and for all that he was just my imaginary friend. A few years later, the Great East Japan earthquake shook Japan. I wanted to help the disaster-stricken areas, so I took part in a volunteer group to clean up the mess that the earthquake and tsunami had caused. It happened after about a week of being a volunteer. That day, I was in charge of the soup kitchen serving pork soup to the people affected by the disaster. There was a long queue and I was handing them out when suddenly one man caught my eye. There was something familiar about this man. He was one of the shabbiest looking individuals compared to the majority of other victims. And when that man was finally standing in front of me, it hit me. I was still holding the soup and I froze. I was sure of it. He was the man that kidnapped Ozawa all those years ago. The man finally looked up, and when he saw my face, he froze too. I think it was only a matter of seconds, but everything went silent. He said, It sounded like he was trying to say something. I saw his eyes fill up with tears. Ta. He was trying to say my name, but it sounded like he had some kind of speech impediment. And then I understood. He was Ozawa. Hey, give him the soup. I snapped out of it when the manager called out to me to hurry up and give the man his soup. I handed him the soup and the man took it, cupping it with his hands. I called out his name as I gave him the soup, and when I did, I saw his hands tremble so much that the soup almost spilled out. He looked straight at me, tears rolling down his face. The person behind him was getting annoyed and nudged him to hurry up. By this time, the man, who I'm certain was Ozawa, was crying so hard he was hiccuping. He slowly walked away, turning around over and over again to look at me, and eventually disappeared into the crowd. Do you know that guy? Another volunteer asked after he saw our exchange. I think so, I replied. After I finished handing out the last soup, I hurried onto the floor to look for Ozawa. I was desperate to see him again, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't find him anywhere. I used every second of my free time that day to look in every nook and cranny, but once again he had disappeared into thin air. It's been 10 years since that day. Ozawa's existence is really beginning to disappear from my memory, but once in a blue moon, I get a sudden flashback of him. When we met at the Disaster Relief Center, why did he recognize me, and I, him? The kidnapping that I witnessed when I was in elementary school. It's incredulous to think that the young Ozawa was kidnapped by his adult self. I will never be able to explain this nor understand why he suddenly disappeared and why I'm the only one who remembers him. I wonder what kind of life he's led. I wonder if he's still alive. Even though he's shrouded in mystery, one thing is certain. Ozawa is real and he exists. And that's why I would do anything to see him again. This happened to me when I was a university student and was living alone in an apartment in Tokyo. That night I was lounging around reading some manga with the TV on when the doorbell rang. I looked at the clock and it was already past 11 p.m. I knew it couldn't be any of my friends because I hadn't made any plans that night and they weren't the type to come around without giving me a heads up, especially at this hour. So I decided to ignore it. But less than a minute later, it rang again. The apartment I lived in had an auto lock system on the ground floor, so visitors had to ring the door from the lobby and could only enter the building once it was unlocked. And there was a doorbell just outside the entrance to each unit too. If anyone walked out of the building, anyone could slip through and enter it, and it happened quite often during the day when there was increased foot traffic. But considering it was late at night and I hadn't let anyone in, I assumed whoever was ringing the bell was on the ground floor, asking to be let in. I suddenly got curious, so I muted the TV and waited in silence. I couldn't hear anything, but now I was starting to feel a bit unsettled, so I tiptoed to the front door and, holding my breath, I slowly looked through the peephole. Standing there was my ex-girlfriend whom I'd broken up with 6 months before. What was she doing here? I unlocked the door but kept the chain on and opened the door. Or at least I tried to, because it didn't budge. Was she blocking it from the other side so that I couldn't open it? What the hell was she trying to do? Feeling annoyed, I looked through the peephole again. She must have been doing the exact same thing because this time, all I could see was her eyeball filling up the entire view. That honestly scared the shit out of me, so I yanked the chain off and pushed open the door with as much force as possible, yelling out at her at the same time. I almost tumbled out because the door opened without any resistance and there was no one there. I lived on the 5th floor, but when I stepped out to go look, the elevator wasn't on my floor. I got sudden goosebumps and I hurried back to my apartment and locked the door behind me. I was racking my brain trying to make sense of what just happened. I know I saw my ex-girlfriend standing right there, but where did she go in that split second between seeing her eyeball and opening the door? Could it have been a ghost? I happened to look down at my hands when I saw a bunch of lines drawn with red, blue, and black pen on my left hand. What the hell? How did that happen? I know I didn't do it myself. I grabbed my phone to call her, but realized I deleted her number a long time ago, so I had no way of contacting her. Feeling spooked, I called a friend of mine to tell him what had just happened and talked to him until the sun came up. The next day, I fell asleep at my desk while studying. I'm not sure, but I think it was close to midnight when I woke up. Straight away, I was in panic mode because I wasn't even halfway done with my report that was due the next day. I went to grab a drink and sat back down at my desk to continue working when I noticed something. There were 2 lines drawn with a thick black marker from my left hand all the way to my elbow. Did I do that while I was sleeping? It was so weird, and I tried to rub it off when I heard something flap behind me. It was really loud, as if someone had just jumped out from under the bed covers or something. Let me just say that I'm a pretty lazy guy, so all my washed clothes are left unfolded in a heap in the corner of my room. And that's where the sound came from. As soon as I heard that sound, I turned around instinctively and I let out a scream. I felt the blood drain from my extremities and I couldn't move a single muscle. There was something poking out from the mountain of clothes. It was my ex-girlfriend's head. Her face was completely void of any expression as she was just staring at me without blinking. We must have been staring at each other for a while when my adrenaline finally kicked in and I ran out of my apartment screaming. Once outside, I fell to the floor and couldn't get up anymore. I was completely petrified and I sat there crying like a child. A woman who looked to be in her 30s must have heard me because she came out of her unit to see what was going on. I grabbed onto her and begged her to call the police. When the police arrived, I finally started breathing normally and told them there was someone in the room, and so they went in to check. They came out after a few minutes and told me no one was there, but I didn't believe it, so I basically ordered them to look under the pile of clothes. They went back in and walked out with my clothes in their arms, and to my horror, said that there was no one there. I told them what had happened the night before as well, and they agreed to increase patrols around my area, but there was no way I was going to go back into my apartment, so I stayed at a friend's house that night and moved out very shortly after. Was I seeing things? Had I gone crazy? There are times when I still question myself, but what I saw looked like a real, living human being. Can ghosts actually look that alive? Hey guys, I hope you enjoyed the 3 stories I brought to you today. This last one makes me wonder whether the guy saw his ex-girlfriend's Ikiryo. If you've seen my Ikiryo video, you'll be able to give me your opinion on this, and if you haven't, I'll put the link at the very end. As usual, thanks for tuning in. If you haven't subscribed yet and want to continue listening to creepy Japanese horror stories, then please do so. Thank you for your support, and I'll see you again very soon.